Thank you so much, Todd. Isn't that why we're here today? We want to know him more. And this book that we're studying together is all about getting to know him more. And came from him and is about him. And we find that as we're looking now at the 7 churches, that Christ identifies himself in a very special way with every single circumstance described in the 7 churches. Do you remember what we talked about, to whom those messages apply? We've talked about the various philosophies people have of how to interpret Revelation and so on. You remember I mentioned that our understanding is that indeed the messages did apply to the churches of John's day. Otherwise, they would have been nonsensical messages for those people. But unlike the preterists who want to relegate all of Revelation to that time period, we believe it goes beyond that. And that it also describes God's church throughout history and applies to God's church throughout history from the time of John throughout the time until Christ comes. And so we seem to, our church, follow along in the historical understanding of the application of these messages. And they do particularly relate to certain periods of the church, characteristic of the church as a whole during certain periods of history, and we'll talk about that as we go along. But that is not all that it's about. It's nice to understand what happened in John's day and try to draw a few lessons, and it's nice to understand the various phases the church has gone through. But you know as well as I that we as individual Christians, and often we as a corporate group of Christians as a church, go through various stages of our Christian experience. Sometimes we're on a mountain and sometimes we're in a valley. Sometimes we have the flush of the first love because we've just accepted Jesus. And sometimes we've been at it for decades and decades, and we get a little bit discouraged sometimes. Or sometimes we're tempted to do a little compromise in our Christian experience. All of those situations are addressed in the letters to the 7 churches. And so as we study these, we find personal applications to our individual lives. And we find that this is not a dead letter at all. These are not dead letters. These are letters that are alive. As Peter says, it's the living word. And as we partake of the living word through Christ and through the ministry of his Holy Spirit, hopefully then it burns within our hearts and it causes life to develop and to grow within our Christian experience. And we begin to reflect the one that Todd just sang about. Last time we were together, we talked about the letter to the church of Ephesus. And you remember, of course, that there the message was particularly to those who had lost their first love experience. The fires of that original zeal for Christ had burned kind of low. And you remember, of course, that he counseled that church to go back and do those first works. Very much like we counsel a married couple sometimes who've kind of gotten mundane in their relationship and things aren't really as, well, the way they used to be. And a lot of times we who try to counsel and help people in those circumstances suggest that they go back and look at what they did at the beginning and begin to institute some of those things, some of the ways they treated one another. And so we find that Christ identified himself with the Ephesian church in the way they needed him most. But now as we go on, and you remember the Ephesian experience not only was the original church in Ephesus there, but it was also characteristic of the early Christian church. From the time the apostles, the time of Acts of the Apostles would be that time period, where the Holy Spirit is doing His mighty work and the gospel is going to the world. And then, of course, as it goes along and Christ has been gone a while, they begin to lose that fervor. As we come into the second message, beginning in chapter 2, verse 8, let me tell you a little story first. About 70 years after the Apostle John wrote these words that he says the Father himself gave to Christ, and Christ gave to the angel, and the angel gave to John, remember? About 70 years after that, of course, John said he also wrote it down for us, and that we're blessed if we read them and take to heart those things that are written there and do them. So it's important for us to study these things. About 70 years after that took place, after he wrote it all down, there was a time of persecution going on for some Christians, and particularly in the city of Smyrna. And the man who had been pastor in Smyrna for 40 years, who history tells us most likely knew personally the author of the Apocalypse, was arrested. Some of his members had already been through a lot of troubles. And one Friday night, just after the Sabbath had begun, by the way, this story causes a lot of early church historians to believe that we have evidence in this story that indeed in Smyrna, in this time period in the 2nd century, the seventh-day Sabbath was still very well and alive and was being kept by Polycarp himself, this pastor. Polycarp was caught up with at some friend's home where he was kind of in hiding at a farm, and on a Friday night. And as the Roman soldiers had come to get Polycarp, the pastor of the church of Smyrna, he asked the lady of the house if she would be willing to make a nice meal and feed these soldiers that had come to arrest him. And so while the soldiers were eating their supper and while they were waiting for this kindly old gentleman that we know had to be in his late 80s, from his statement we know he's at least 86. He may have been 86 plus a few years leading to his baptism. We're not sure exactly his age. 80s, 90s. After they fed the soldiers, Polycarp knelt there and prayed for 2 hours for all the Christians that he could think of that needed those prayers. And the soldiers were patient enough, according to the story, to allow him to do that. Maybe the fact that he fed them had something to do with that. What do you think? Do you think Polycarp was exhibiting the kind of love that Christ had suggested or commanded? But the soldiers eventually, after Polycarp's prayer, they took him and they headed back to Smyrna, because the next day they were going to take him into the great amphitheater in Smyrna. There'd already been a lot of things happen in that amphitheater that day, and it was later in the day that Polycarp was brought in a carriage to the amphitheater. One story I read suggests that on his way out of the carriage, he kind of bumped his shin but didn't say anything about it. But the governor, Status Quadratus, was very reticent to kill this older, regal-looking Christian Polycarp. And so he pled with Polycarp. He thought, surely when Polycarp realizes that Jesus was a criminal who was executed by the Roman government, surely if I reason with him, he'll understand the errors of his ways and he'll leave that behind. And what they were trying to do was to get him to offer incense to the emperor. And those who did not offer incense to the emperor were known as atheists. An odd situation for a Christian to find himself in, to be accused of being an atheist, right? But you have to remember, the Romans who believed in that particular philosophy believed that if you couldn't see the God, there was no God, see? And so for them, the Christians were atheists. And so they asked Polycarp to say, do away with the atheists and offer incense. And one story I read suggests that he turned to the crowd of onlookers, who were all, of course, non-Christians. Many of them were Jews, actually, as well, who were also very, very much a part of this whole thing against Polycarp. And he said, away with the atheists. Well, that didn't work. It was the wrong group he was referring to. Finally, the governor asked him, can't you at least deny Christ? And he says, 86 years have I served him, and never has he done me wrong. How can I curse my king who has saved me? And so, because it was too late in the day and it was illegal for them to use the lions now, they put Polycarp on a stake, tied him to the stake, and the story says that the Jews were some of the most vigorous ones to grab the wood and put it around him. And the reason I mentioned that was it just happened to be that this was a high Sabbath, according to the stories I've read. And you know then that very much like they treated Jesus, they treated Polycarp that day. Most stories suggest that he was not really allowed to burn to death. They had a little mercy on him, and one of the soldiers was commanded to pierce him, to kill him, and run him through. Reminds me of the one who made sure Jesus was dead. What a story, isn't it? And it reminds us that this church of Smyrna is connected with a particular experience that Christians sometimes are called to go through. Let's read the message. Verse 8. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. I know your works, tribulation and poverty, but you are rich. Notice, they think they're poor, but they're rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. Now, we can already see from the story I told that there was a time right there in the Smyrna church itself where for several literal days they were persecuted. But it's also true that there was a historical period that fits the Smyrna situation fairly early on in Christian church history. And it's during the time, it lasts through the time of the Roman persecutions, of which there were more than one. The final one, and the most vigorous one, happened to be from the years 303 through 313. How many years would that be? From 303 to 313? 10-year time period. Started under the reign, you may have remembered, if you remember your Roman history, of Diocletian, who was probably the most severe of the emperors to fight against Christians. Under him, it was initiated, and by the way, his successors continued it and carried it through for that 10-year period. Under him, they would take any Christian communities and try to destroy them. Any Christian churches were razed to the ground. Any Christian books were burned. Many Christians died as a result of being Christian, and many who did not die were put into slavery. It was a hard time during this period of Christian church history, which only came to an end, by the way, with the first Christian, quotes, emperor, and we'll talk about that in our next church. Constantine came along. Diocletian was quite a fellow. You'll notice in the message that it mentions 10 days of tribulation. It's interesting that the numbers used in Revelation, as we've mentioned before, have to do more with principles and characteristics than they do with just the literal number. But the literal number seems to fit as well. 10 is often connected in the scriptures with trial and testing. 10 plagues. 10 days from the Feast of Trumpets to test and get ready for the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Remember the 10-day trial in Daniel's day? We talked about that back in our last series. Remember in that first sermon on Daniel 1, we talked about the 10 days of testing that Daniel requested. So 10 seems to be significant of the test that God's people go through from time to time. Does God know when things happen to us that are bad? Does he? Does he want to identify with us in those circumstances? When the pagans are hostile, when they accuse the Christians of being cannibals because they believe that they're eating flesh and drinking blood in the communion service, when they accuse them of having orgies because they have these agape love feasts, when the community misunderstands a group, and they call them atheists, when in actuality they're worshiping the true God of heaven. When they teach that God's going to destroy the world by fire someday, and Nero uses it to his advantage and accuses the Christians of burning Rome. When people misunderstand you and they cause you grief and trial and problems, is Christ there with you? Does he come to you and say, I've been there? I was dead and I'm alive. He says, in fact, I will give you a crown of life. And did you notice the promise that he ends with at the very last of the message? What's the promise? Remember where it says, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by what? The second death. Isn't that interesting? Why doesn't he just say, if it's immortality of the soul idea, why doesn't he just, you won't be hurt by death? Did you know the second death is only mentioned in the book of Revelation as far as specifically being called the second death? We'll look at it again when we get into chapter 20 in quite detail. But here, early on, we have this promise for these people who are facing death itself because of their faith. You will not have to fear the second death. You may have to die the anesthetic death. You may have to take a nap for a while. You may have to lay down and sleep until I come. But you don't have to worry about the second death. We'll talk about that when we talk about the lake of fire. We don't want to steal all that thunder today. But isn't it wonderful to know that we don't have to worry about the second death? Some of you out here today are facing terminal illness. Did you know Christ is with you through that? He may allow you to face death, but it's the death of sleep, not the second death. Aren't we grateful for that? And what's the reward? A crown which is life. The crown of life. And so, when we are facing certain circumstances, Christ comes to us just as we need him and identifies with us and says, I understand, but I'm with you through it. Just like he was walking in the midst of those candlesticks, he's right here with us today, walking in our midst, identifying with us. And when we are facing that time which looks so dark, he says, don't worry, I'm the first and the last. I'm the one who died, and I've risen again. And I'm going to give you the crown of life, and you won't have to worry about the second death. Oh, what a message. We all need that message, and there are times in our lives in particular we need that. Did you notice as we were reading that the people thought that they were poor, but in God's words, in parentheses, it says what? They are rich. That's right, Susan. They are rich. Later on, we're going to see a church that thinks they're rich, and God says they're poor. Isn't that interesting? How so often we miscalculate, we misunderstand our circumstances. And those times when we think things are terrible, and we don't have what we need, God looks at us and says, now you're rich. Now you're rich. Because these things we face that are hard in life are what bring about the trying of the gold, the refining of the gold and the silver. And it make us rich in faith. I hate to go to the next church because it's such a contrast. Here you have those who are so faithful in their persecution and in their hard times. And now we come to Pergamos. To reach Smyrna, we traveled from Ephesus about 40 miles to the north-northwest, mainly north. And now to go on around the route, we go due north up to Pergamos. And true to its name, which means exalted or elevated or high, Pergamos was on a 1,300-foot hilltop. More than 2,500 years ago, that hilltop was made into a plateau, and buildings were built, all kinds of big buildings. It was a prosperous place. Now, Smyrna was prosperous as well. But Pergamos is kind of known as the leading center of Asia Minor there. So beautiful, such wonderful surroundings, so blessed financially. Croesus, some called the wealthiest man who ever lived, was from Pergamos. In fact, one of their citizens, Attalus, was so wealthy that he gave the gift of the Stoa to the city of Athens. Built the Stoa for him as a gift. It was a wealthy place. They had a school of medicine there. Some of you remember the name Galen, well-known physician, practiced medicine in Pergamos. There you can still find the old, well, it's hard to make out, I think, but it's still the inscription of Asclepius. Is that the way you say it? Anyway, the forerunner of the caduceus, the healing serpent. The counterfeit to the true serpent of Moses, remember, on the brazen serpent in the wilderness. Caduceus, of course, you'll find in our world very prominent today, won't you, in just about any medical institution. Pergamos, there was a time when Ptolemy V of Egypt had an embargo against Pergamos and wouldn't allow their paper products from Egypt to come up there. And so Pergamos worked on its own, and we find, just like we see in some of the financial things of today, like we're trying to find alternative sources of energy. Pergamos found an alternative source of writing. They developed parchment in Pergamos, refined leather to write on. And Pergamos has a great library of over 200,000 scrolls. Pergamos, well-to-do, intelligentsia at Pergamos, lots of culture, lots of really fine things. What would you think would happen to the Christians in that kind of an atmosphere? What do you think? Where things are so good. Let's read the message to Pergamos. To the angel of the church in Pergamos write, these things says he who has the sharp two-edged sword. Remember, where do we find the sharp two-edged sword coming? Comes out of Christ's mouth. Remember back in chapter 1. I know your works and where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. I've got to stop there. One thing I didn't mention about Pergamos. When the Persians came in and took over Babylon, many of the Babylonian priests, you know, the ones that had all the secrets of the Babylonian religion, all the astrologers and all those wonderful insights they had, many of them moved to Pergamos. They fled and they settled in Pergamos. And Pergamos was the center of the ancient Babylonian delusions. There was a reason why it's called the seat of Satan, or the throne of Satan. And you hold, though they lived there, you hold fast my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days in which Antipas was my faithful martyr. I'd like to know more about Antipas, but we're not told much. But evidently, the persecution had reached Pergamos as well, but this was past history now. Who was killed among you where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you. And remember, there were two churches he does not have things against. We just left the one, Smyrna. And next to the last one, Philadelphia, will be similar. But Pergamos, I have some things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, and to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit sexual immorality. Let's stop there. Do you remember the story of Balaam? Young people, you need to remember this story. You know what the story of Balaam was? Remember, Balaam was a prophet that King Balak tried to get to curse Israel. Israel was camped in the valley of the Jordan River, just opposite from Jericho. Beautiful area. Just getting ready to cross the Jordan River and enter into the promised land of Canaan. This was the last great event that happened before they entered in. It was a sad story. You remember, God would not let Balaam curse Israel, and every time he tried to curse Israel, he only blessed them. And Balak was beside himself with fury. And finally, Balaam, because he wanted Balak's money so much, suggested a way that they could bring the curse upon them. What was it? Do you remember what he did? Basically, he threw a big party. And through social interaction and inviting Israel to come in and enjoy the music and the dancing and the wine and all that goes with it, many of the Israelites were enticed. And because they began to do some of the practices of those around them that were not consistent with God's way, their morals began to break down. It was a sad experience. There were 24,000 that were lost as a result of that creeping compromise. Some of you remember a book by that name. Pergamos. Pergamos had a challenge, and that was that all of these wonderful things around them were enticing and causing many of them to slip away from Jesus. And there was another problem that had been mentioned back in the church of Ephesus, but now you'll notice is still with the church in the time of Pergamos. Verse 15. Thus you also have those who hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which thing I hate. And what was that doctrine? It was very similar to the problem with Balaam. This was the doctrine that once you accepted Christ, then it could never change. Once saved, always saved. But the problem with that was that also along with it was it didn't matter then how you lived once you accept Christ. And so the Nicolaitans were facing a lot of challenges. And the ones in Pergamos were being affected by that. Verse 16, he says, repent, or else I will come to you quickly and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. Why the sword of his mouth? Because when we begin to draw away, what's the cure? Learning about God. Learning who he is, what his will is, what his way is. The living and enduring Word of God reaching into the heart. And so he says, I will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna to eat. What's the hidden manna? Some of the hidden manna to eat. What's manna about? Remember, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Remember, the manna was God's sustaining grace within the life that was received daily through his word. They had to pick it up every morning, fresh in the morning. The hidden manna. Not sure. I wonder if maybe that's even referring to the manna that was in the Ark of the Covenant. You think? Wouldn't you love to taste some of that? But he says he will give us this hidden manna to eat, to sustain us, to help us to grow and develop. And I will give him a white stone. White stone. Been a lot of people wondering about that. One explanation I read was that the Roman practice often for judgment was to have a white stone and a black stone. And if you were guilty, you got the black stone. But if you were exonerated, innocent, you received a white stone, acquitted. I would like to be found innocent through Jesus. Wouldn't you? And wouldn't you love to have this new name he's promised, and on that stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it? What do you think Christ's secret name is for you? There were some that suggest that it's God's own name on there, that name that's unutterable, that is so sacred. Whatever it is, I do know that God has plans for you. Just like he had plans for Abram, who became Abraham. Just like he had plans for Jacob, you know, the liar and the cheater and the supplanter, who became Israel, the overcomer. And these letters keep talking to those who overcome, right? Overcome. God has a new name for you. And it's going to be on a white stone that he will give you. And you know when he gives it to you, that through the grace of Jesus, through the perfection of Christ, his kingdom and his name and his character is yours. I will give him a white stone, and on the stone a new name written, which no one knows except him who receives it. Oh, I can hardly wait for that day. How about yourself? Won't that be a wonderful time? So whether we're in the depths of despair and persecution and facing death itself, or whether we're surrounded by culture and bright lights and all kinds of enticing things, we need Christ. And the way we need him, he comes to us. And he's always available in every circumstance to meet our needs.